There was a boy named Steve who was attending a high school in the western part of the United States. Steve was very muscular, a real strong young man. Mr. Christensen was a teacher at this particular school where Steve attended classes. Mr. Christensen had an open door policy in his classroom. Any student that got there on time would not be thrown out unless they were highly disruptive. That was not the case for Stephen in his other classes. Stephen kept getting kicked out of different classes, and now he needed to stay in this last class in order to graduate. He had been kicked out of all the other 6 periods, and so he only had one teacher who would accept him, and that was Mr. Christensen. Steve was told by Mr. Christensen that he could not be late. So Steve arrived just seconds before the bell rang, and he would sit at the very back of the classroom. He would also be the first one to leave when class was over. One day, Mr. Christensen asked Steve to stay after class so that he could talk with him. Mr. Christensen was a man of faith, and he was concerned about Steve, whether or not Steve knew God's grace. After class, Mr. Christensen pulled Steve aside and said, "So you think you're pretty tough, don't you?" Steve's answer was, "Yeah, I do." Then Mr. Christensen asked, "How many push-ups can you do?" Steve said, "I can do 200. I do 200 every night." 200, that's pretty good, Steve, Mr. Christensen said. "Do you think you could do 300? Steve replied, "I don't know. I've never done 300 at a time." "Do you think you could?" Mr. Christensen asked again. "Well, I can try," said Steve. "Can you do 300 in sets of 10? I need you to do 300 in sets of 10. I have a plan for something I'm going to do on the Friday before Easter. You'll need to do 300 push-ups in sets of 10 for this to work. Can you do it? I need you to tell me yes or no if you can do it," Mr. Christensen asked. Steve said, "Well, I think I can. Yeah, I can do it." Mr. Christensen said, "Good. I need you to do it on this Friday. It'll be the 6th hour just before Easter vacation begins." Friday came, and Steve got to class early. He sat in the very front of the room. When class started, Mr. Christensen pulled out a huge box of lovely donuts. Now, these weren't normal kinds of donuts. They were the extra fancy big kind with cream centers and frosting swirls. Everyone was pretty excited that it was Friday, the last day of the class, and they were going to get an early start on the holiday weekend eating these delicious donuts. Mr. Christensen went to the first girl in the first row, and he said, "Cynthia, do you want a donut?" Cynthia said, "Yes." Mr. Christensen turned to Steve and asked, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Cynthia can have a donut?" Steve said, "Sure." He jumped out of his desk, went down, did a quick 10, got back in his desk. Mr. Christensen then put a donut on Cynthia's desk. She was happy. Mr. Christensen then went to Joe, the next person sitting right behind Cynthia, and he asked, "Joe, do you want a donut?" Joe said, "Yes." Mr. Christensen asked, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Joe can have a donut?" Steve did the 10 push-ups. Joe got a donut, and so it went down the first aisle. Steve did 10 push-ups for every person before they got their donut, down the second aisle, till Mr. Christensen came to John. Now, John was the captain of the football team. He was the center of the basketball team. He was a big, strong guy. He was very popular and never lacking for female companionship. Mr. Christensen asked John, "Do you want a donut?" John's reply was, "Well, can I do my own push-ups?" Mr. Christensen said, "No, Steve has to do them." Well, then John said, "I don't want one of them." Mr. Christensen then turned to Steve and asked, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so John can have the donut that he doesn't want?" Steve started to do the 10 push-ups. John said, "Hey, I said I don't want one." Mr. Christensen said, "Look, this is my classroom. This is my class. These are my desks. These are my donuts. Just leave it on the desk if you don't want it." After Steve did 10 push-ups for John, Mr. Christensen put that donut on John's desk. Now, by this time, Steve, in doing the push-ups, had begun to slow down a little bit. He just stayed on the floor now between sets instead of going back to his seat because it took too much effort to get up and down from his chair. You could start to see perspiration coming down around his brow. Mr. Christensen now was heading down the third row. Now the students were beginning to get quite angry. Mr. Christensen asked Jenny, "Jenny, do you want a donut?" Jenny said, "No." Then Mr. Christensen asked Steve, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so Jenny can have a donut that she doesn't want?" Steve did 10, Jenny got a donut. By now, all the students were saying no. And so there were all these uneaten donuts sitting on the desks. Steve was also really having to put forth a lot of effort to get all of these push-ups done for each donut, 10 each. There began to be a pool of sweat on the floor beneath his face. His arms and his brow were beginning to get red because of the physical effort involved. Mr. Christensen asked Robert, one of the other class members, to watch Steve to make sure that Steve did all 10 push-ups in a set, because Mr. Christensen couldn't bear to watch all of Steve's work for all these uneaten donuts. So Robert began to watch Steve closely. Mr. Christensen started down the fourth row of the classroom. During this time, because of the noise and the commotion going on in the class, some students who had been out in the hall had wandered in. They were curious, and they sat along the heaters located on the sides of the room because all the desks were filled. Mr. Christensen realized this. He did a quick count, and he saw 4 extra students. Now there were 34 students in the room. He started to worry if Steve would make it. Mr. Christensen went on to the next person and the next and the next, and near the end of that row, Steve was really having a really rough time doing 10 push-ups for every donut that was set on the desk that the people sitting there didn't want to receive. He was taking a lot more time to complete each of the 10 sets. Steve asked Mr. Christensen, "Do I have to make my nose touch the ground on each one?" Mr. Christensen thought a moment. "Well, they're your push-ups. You can do them any way that you want." Steve did 10 more perfect push-ups, and Mr. Christensen went on. A few moments later, another young man, Jason, was about to come into the classroom because he heard all the commotion, and he was about to open the door when all the students yelled to him, "No, Jason, no, don't come in, stay out." Jason didn't know what was going on. Steve picked up his head and said, "No, let him come in." Mr. Christensen said, "Steve, you realize that if Jason comes in, you'll have to do 10 more push-ups for him, plus an extra 40 push-ups for the 4 students that I hadn't counted on." Steve said, "Yes, I'll do all those push-ups. Let Jason come in." Mr. Christensen said, "Okay, I'll let you get Jason's push-ups out of the way right now. Jason, do you want a donut?" "Yes," Jason said. Jason didn't have a clue, except for the fact that those donuts looked delicious. "Steve, will you do 10 push-ups, please, so that Jake can have a donut?" Steve did 10 push-ups very slowly with great effort. Jason, bewildered, was handed a donut and he sat down. Mr. Christensen finished the 4th row, started down the seat, those seated on the heaters for those extra 4 students. Steve's arms were shaking visibly now. With each push-up, he struggled to lift himself up against the force of gravity, and sweat was dropping from his face, and by this time, people were moved to tears. There was not a dry eye in the room. Even Jason had caught on to what was going on. The very last 2 girls in the room were cheerleaders and very popular. Mr. Christensen went to Linda, the second to the last, and he asked, "Linda, do you want a donut?" Linda said very sadly, "No, thank you." Mr. Christensen asked Steve, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Linda can have a donut that she doesn't want?" Grunting from the effort, Steve did 10 very slow push-ups for Linda. Then Mr. Christensen turned to the very last girl, Susan. "Susan, He could barely get the words out. Do you want a donut? Susan, with tears flowing down her face, asked Mr. Christensen, can I help him? Mr. Christensen, with tears of his own streaming down his own face, said, no, he has to do it alone. Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Susan can have a donut? As Steve slowly finished the 10th push-up for Susan, with the understanding that he had accomplished all that had been required of him, having done 350 push-ups, his arms buckled beneath him and Steve fell to the floor. He was so tired. He just lay there, breathing hard, recovering from this extraordinary effort. All eyes turned to Mr. Christensen. Mr. Christensen spoke to the students carefully. This was his moment to get the message of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice across to them. He said, this is similar to how it was with our Savior, Jesus Christ. He said to the Father before his death, into your hands I commit my spirit, and with the understanding that he had done everything that was required of him, Jesus collapsed on the cross and he died in order to give the gift of grace and mercy even to those who at this point had not yet received that gift, but would always have that opportunity before them to receive the gift of Christ, God's grace shown in mercy on a man dying on the cross.